Greetings, and thank you for being here. I'm truly grateful that you've chosen to watch this video. Your presence and support mean a lot, and subscribing to the channel would bring me even greater satisfaction. With that said, let's begin. I'm Gavin. I had been married to my wife Alice for 8 years when everything collapsed on a day that seemed ordinary at first. For almost a decade, I believed our marriage was built on a foundation of love, trust, and respect. Alice had remained at home for most of that time, a decision we both agreed upon once my career earnings were enough to comfortably sustain us. Working as a financial consultant meant my days were long. I often left before dawn and didn't return until after dark. Our lives unfolded in a quiet neighborhood where neighbors exchanged greetings, shared casual chats across fences, and sometimes came together for cookouts. It seemed like the kind of place where serious troubles never intruded. Living right next door was Jeff. He was in his early 40s, recently divorced, and earned his living as a freelance graphic designer. Outwardly, he seemed friendly and helpful, quick to lend a hand or share tools. Looking back now, I realized the warning signs were there. I simply ignored them. Alice began bringing up Jeff's name more often than felt natural in everyday conversation. She always seemed to know his schedule or what he was up to. I now recall how she would put more effort into her appearance on days she claimed to have bumped into him while outside in the garden or fetching the mail. At the time, though, I dismissed these details. I was too focused on my career and too secure in our relationship to even consider betrayal. I trusted Alice without question. The thought of her being unfaithful never crossed my mind, until one particular afternoon changed everything. That day, I had finished a client meeting earlier than expected. Instead of returning to the office, I thought I'd surprise Alice by coming home for lunch. I imagined it would be a pleasant gesture, a rare chance for us to share a quiet meal. I left the car in the driveway rather than pulling into the garage, hoping to catch her off guard in a good way. It was around 1:30 p.m., and Jeff's car was parked outside his house as usual, which didn't raise any suspicion since he often worked from home. I slipped the front door open as quietly as I could, expecting to find Alice upstairs or maybe outside, but faint sounds from the second floor made me pause. Something about them set me on edge. Climbing the stairs, my unease grew heavier with each step. As I approached the bedroom, the noises became painfully clear. My wife was in our bed with another man. The whispers, the gasps, the rhythm of it all left no doubt. They were so lost in the moment that they didn't hear me coming. I stood there in shock, unable to move. A part of me desperately wanted to believe I was mistaken, but reality was undeniable. When I finally opened the door, the sight before me crushed whatever hope remained. Alice and Jeff were entangled together, completely oblivious to my presence in the doorway. The rage that erupted in me was unlike anything I had ever experienced. I wasn't a violent man, but in that instant, my restraint disappeared. I lunged at Jeff and we crashed to the floor. My fists struck him over and over while he tried to shield himself. Alice's screams sounded far away, as though muffled, unimportant. Eventually, Jeff managed to scramble free, his face bloodied, and rushed to pull on his clothes. Still half-dressed, he fled out the door with his shirt in hand, while I shouted words I can hardly recall now. I watched him stumble away, my hands stained and my chest heaving. Turning back, I found Alice at the top of the stairs, crying uncontrollably, barely covered. Her tears didn't move me. They only sharpened the pain of betrayal. I looked at her and delivered the words that ended our marriage. I told her it was finished. My tone was cold, stripped of any warmth. She tried to answer, but I walked away and locked myself inside my study. That room became my refuge, the one corner of the house untouched by what I had seen. In the days that followed, I lived between the office and that study. I filled the hours with work, with silence, with books, anything to avoid her. Alice tried repeatedly to speak with me, but I couldn't bear to listen. The woman I had once loved now felt like a stranger, and her words pierced like blades I no longer wanted to endure. I redirected all my energy into dissolving the marriage with the same determination I had once devoted to sustaining it. I contacted a divorce lawyer right away, insisting we move quickly. The attorney handled the process efficiently, knowing I wanted closure without delay. Jeff disappeared from my life altogether. I assumed he moved away. Part of me wondered if he'd pressed charges after the fight, but nothing ever came of it. Within 2 weeks, the paperwork was complete. My lawyer told me it was unusually fast given the details involved. When I placed the documents in Alice's hands, her reaction was as I expected: tears, pleading, desperation. She insisted it was a mistake, a moment of weakness, that she still loved me, and that Jeff meant nothing. She blamed temptation, even the devil, as though that might lessen the weight of her betrayal. But my decision was final. The trust was destroyed, the marriage beyond repair. There was no turning back. My efforts to grasp the logic behind her actions proved fruitless. The foundation of trust that once held our relationship together had crumbled beyond repair. It no longer mattered whether her betrayal was born from a moment of weakness, poor judgment, or a deliberate decision. What mattered was that she had broken the vow we had once held sacred. Though she pleaded for forgiveness and promised to change, the course toward separation had already begun. Complicating matters was the fact that Alice hadn't held a job for the majority of our marriage. With no career to fall back on, she had a legal right to a substantial financial settlement. Rather than stretch this out with monthly alimony, I opted for a single significant payment. This wasn't just generosity, it was calculated. I wanted to eliminate any lingering ties and begin rebuilding my life without her shadow. The judge supported the decision, reasoning that she would be better served by starting over independently than relying indefinitely on my support. Some people might argue it was unfair. After all, she broke her vows and still left with a large sum. I didn't like it either. But the legal system isn't built to dispense emotional justice. What she received was more than enough to start fresh. Many might have called it overly generous considering the circumstances. But we had spent almost 10 years together, and regardless of how things ended, the law ensured she wouldn't walk away destitute. The house, however, presented a more difficult challenge. Even though I had purchased it before our marriage, nearly a decade of shared living had blurred the lines of ownership. My attorney pointed out that I alone had covered most of the mortgage and improvements, but we both knew it could still be deemed a shared marital asset. Eventually, through a detailed paper trail and persistent negotiations, we reached a settlement. I would keep the house, while Alice would receive compensation through other assets. Her final settlement remained considerable, but I managed to retain the home, an anchor amid the upheaval. That house held deep personal value. It was the one piece of my life that had remained stable, as everything else collapsed. Giving it up would have felt like losing the last solid piece of who I was. Watching her pack her belongings and leave that space we had once shared was among the most painful experiences I've faced. Despite everything, a part of me still clung to the image of who she had been, the person I once loved. Emotionally, I was unraveling. The rage that initially consumed me eventually gave way to a quiet, aching sorrow. I had truly loved her. I had envisioned growing old together. That future was gone, leaving behind a void I couldn't ignore. Some evenings, I would sit alone in my study, letting my thoughts drift to better times. Our wedding, our travels, the long conversations about what lay ahead. Though those memories had been tarnished by betrayal, they still retained a haunting kind of beauty. I found myself trapped in a cycle of conflicting emotions, still harboring love for someone who had hurt me deeply. The emotional turbulence wore me down. I shifted constantly between anger, grief, and a kind of numbness that eventually became a coping mechanism. I often found myself wondering how long the affair had lasted. How many times had she brought that man into our home? Into our bed? I wasn't perfect, but I had been present. I had tried. After the divorce was finalized, I made a decisive turn inward, toward my career. I buried myself in work with a kind of obsessive determination. I expanded my client list, took on late hours, and threw myself into professional growth. Dating wasn't even a consideration. The idea of opening myself up again felt impossible. After Alice, I built emotional walls no one could breach. Love felt perilous, whereas financial security and professional success were safe, quantifiable, and under my control. Friends and family tried to encourage me to move on, but I refused to entertain the idea. Her betrayal had seared through my ability to trust. The idea of being that vulnerable again was unbearable. So I kept my days full, isolated myself, and focused on healing. Slowly, quietly. I started reshaping a version of life where she didn't exist. I redesigned the bedroom, replaced every piece of furniture that reminded me of her, especially the bed. Sleeping in that space had become unbearable. Gradually, I found solace in structure. Weekdays were for work, weekends for house projects, and occasional low-key dinners with a few friends who understood my need for distance. It wasn't the life I once imagined, but it was stable. And above all, it was mine. A year passed in this rhythm. I had adapted to solitude and even come to appreciate the calm it brought. I began to think that maybe this was enough, a life of quiet routine, free of emotional risk. Then, one Sunday morning in spring, something unexpected happened. It had been a full 12 months since the divorce was finalized. I was in the kitchen, sipping coffee and browsing the paper, when a knock interrupted the stillness. I wasn't expecting anyone. Early visitors were rare. When I opened the door, I saw Alice standing there. She looked different, tidy but subdued, clearly nervous. And of course, she would know exactly when I'd be most off guard. Her timing wasn't accidental. Her voice trembled as she asked if she could come inside. Her sudden presence brought back a wave of emotions I thought I had buried. For a fleeting instant, I remembered how much I had once loved her, how her face used to light up my entire world. But that moment passed quickly, replaced by the hard truth of everything she had done. I didn't move from the doorway. I waited, silent, for her to speak. She assumed that time might have softened my feelings. But she was wrong. The year apart hadn't dulled the hurt. It had crystallized the reality of what her betrayal had cost me. Alice began to speak, her voice trembling with emotion as she launched into a heartfelt plea laced with both anguish and fragile hope. She described how the past 12 months had been consumed by regret, each day shadowed by the memory of her choices. She confessed that not a moment had gone by without her wishing she could reverse the damage she had done and reclaim the life we had once built together. Since the day our marriage came to an end, she had been living with a persistent sense of loss and sorrow that she couldn't shake. She recounted her failed attempts at starting over, efforts that had collapsed under the lingering consequences of her betrayal. Moving on, she admitted, had proved impossible, especially knowing she had been the one to destroy something once so meaningful. Alice didn't try to justify her actions or ask for pardon she hadn't earned. She acknowledged that forgiveness wasn't something she could expect, and that I had every reason to keep my distance. Yet, despite understanding all of that, she told me she couldn't leave without at least trying. The burden of guilt, she said, wouldn't allow her peace unless she made an effort to see whether even the faintest possibility of reconciliation still existed. She wasn't asking to rekindle our marriage, she clarified. She understood that what we had was over, and she wasn't naive enough to believe we could return to what we once were. Still, she asked if there was room for her in my life again, even if only in some small, cautious way. She spoke of love, how hers had never faded, and how our time apart had only convinced her more that I was the only person she had ever truly loved. Alice insisted the previous year had brought clarity, pain, and lessons she hadn't understood before. If I gave her a chance, she said, she would spend whatever time remained proving she could be better. I let her speak without cutting in, listening not only because I needed answers, but also because I was stunned by her sudden return. Part of me wanted to understand what had driven her back after everything that had happened. Another part of me could hardly believe she was actually standing in front of me again. Her voice held no trace of performance, only raw, unfiltered sorrow. I could see the impact of the past year written across her face, and it seemed that, at last, she fully understood the weight of what she had done. But no matter how deeply she regretted it, the past couldn't be rewritten. Her sorrow didn't erase the hurt I had carried, nor could it rebuild the trust that had been shattered the day I discovered her affair. When she finished, I paused, drawing a breath before I answered. I knew I had to speak with clarity without hesitation or confusion. I told her no. The word was quiet, but it rang with finality, free of malice, free of drama. I said I appreciated her apology and believed she was sincere. I even acknowledged that her remorse was real, but too much had been lost. I explained that her betrayal had changed me profoundly, that I was no longer the man who had once offered her his trust without question. What I'd come to learn in the aftermath was that the kind of love we had shared, intense, consuming, and unguarded, was far too dangerous for me to risk again. This wasn't about punishing her. It was about self-preservation. Some wounds, I told her, simply cut too deep to heal. I asked her not to return. Seeing her again reopened old pain, and no good could come from reliving what had already been mourned. I asked her to honor the boundary I was drawing, for both of our sakes. As I spoke, tears welled in Alice's eyes and quietly began to fall. She didn't argue. She nodded through her sobs, accepting what I had said. She thanked me for listening and offered one last apology before she turned and walked away. I watched her reach her car and drive off, a part of me sensing, perhaps even knowing, that this was the last time our lives would intersect. The encounter drained me emotionally, but it brought with it a sense of closure I hadn't realized I still needed. In the days that followed, I found myself replaying her words and my own. There were moments I second-guessed myself, wondering if I had been too unyielding, if there might have been a way to forgive without returning to what was. But I always came back to the same conclusion. The damage between us was irreparable. Once, I had loved her with everything I had, but that love, as deep and genuine as it was, couldn't override the reality of what she had done. Her betrayal hadn't just ended our relationship, it had rewritten who I was. It forced me to see that, in some cases, reconciliation isn't just unlikely, it's unwise. Since the divorce, I had fought hard to rebuild my life, and I wasn't willing to risk that progress for a future haunted by the past. Her visit reminded me not only of the love we once shared, but also of the ache it had left behind. That day felt like a final page in the story of us, a moment that allowed the book to finally close. I never heard from Alice again after that Sunday. I hoped she would find her own kind of peace and perhaps even happiness. But I also knew our paths were now permanently divided. The man who had once given her his heart without hesitation no longer existed. In his place stood someone who had been forced to learn that some betrayals mark you permanently. Looking back, I understand that Alice's infidelity didn't just destroy a marriage. It ended my belief in the kind of love that requires total vulnerability. Whether that loss hardened me or simply protected me, I'm still figuring out. But it's become a part of who I am. I've come to see that love and trust are not synonymous, that it's entirely possible to love someone and still know they cannot be trusted. It's a brutal truth, but one that has reshaped how I move through life. There are still times I wonder what might have been, if I had let her back in, if there had been some path to healing. But I understand now that the person who answered the door that morning was not the same man who once exchanged vows. Her betrayal had changed me too much to ever go back, no matter how much either of us might have wished otherwise. That's what infidelity truly costs. Not just the relationship, but the versions of ourselves who once believed in it without doubt. The man who had trusted her implicitly ceased to exist the moment I learned the truth, and nothing, not regret, not love, not time, could bring him back. That was the true ending of our story.